Hi, and welcome to Marty's Mods. Today, we're going to edit a scene from The Witcher 3 using only shaders. To start, we've already framed up our shot and cropped in on the portion of the image that we want to adjust. Already, we can see here, in this particular area, the game has very strong and unnatural color. One thing we can do is generate some nice atmosphere using Marty's new, soon-to-be-released, path-traced volumetric lighting shader. For this shot, let's generate a lovely mist for the distant background. We'll start by dialing in a slight bit of haze. Additionally, we can also use a slight tint. This has already helped the background feel just a bit more natural. Since this shader isn't designed for gameplay, we normally need to hold the F key to render the fog over multiple frames. However, since we only need the fog for this screenshot, we can use another shader called long exposure to capture the rendered fog, allowing us to continue processing the image, and we can even disable the path-traced volumetric lighting shader as we've already captured its output. Next, let's focus on enhancing the contact shadows of the scene. We can enable the debug view by clicking here, and also let's boost the sample quality. Now, one thing that's really important to understand is that effect order does matter for some effects, and in this case, you never want to draw ambient occlusion over the top of fog. To fix this issue, let's simply move MXAO to render before our path trace volumetric fog. We'll also need to re-render our fog using the long exposure shader again. Once this is done, we can disable both MXAO and the path traced volumetric lighting shader as we've already captured the image from those effects. Now that we've adjusted our scene lighting, let's move on to bloom and enable the Solaris shader. In this shader, we can do an initial exposure adjustment. Solaris uses some clever math under the hood to mimic the way a camera behaves for this, with the log exposure bias slider. Let's brighten the image slightly, and now we can dial in our bloom. Let's bring in just enough to enrich the image. That looks nice. Let's move next to color grading and enable ReGrade. We're going to start by dialing in a nice edge darkening effect using the sensor vignette control. This effect simulates the way in which light hits a camera sensor at different angles, causing a brightness drop-off on the image edges. By using this, we have a nice physically correct vignette as if we took this image with a real camera. To compensate for some of the darkening now, let's go back to Solaris momentarily and lift our exposure up slightly. Now, we'll enable the more advanced version of ReGrade called ReGrade Plus. The ReGrade Plus UI will initially give you a warning if you don't have things set up correctly. If you have the ReGrade Plus UI opened, but don't actually have the shader itself enabled, obviously it can't apply anything to the image, so let's enable it now. Additionally, we need to enable the histogram shader so that ReGrade Plus can provide us real-time information as we adjust the image. When using ReGrade Plus, make sure that you place the histogram after ReGrade Plus in the shader load order. If we move it before ReGrade Plus, we can see that ReGrade Plus cannot show the image changes in its histogram at the top of the UI, so make sure that you move it below in the load order. As we prepare to color grade this image with ReGrade Plus, we can see on the histogram here that the image is not using the entire dynamic range, and the highlights appear to have a slight color cast. Let's work on neutralizing that. Initially, we can use the temperature control while watching the histogram. There, that looks better. Let's quick toggle the change on and off to ensure that the change was good. Looks great. Lab Offset A will shift the image between green and pink, and Lab Offset B will shift between yellow and blue. Using these two controls, we can further fine-tune our highlights and overall color temperature. Additionally, if we hold Shift, we can also use the mouse scroll wheel to make our adjustments. Next, let's address the highlights not using the full dynamic range available to us. Looking here, you can see that there is a very sharp drop-off in the highlights where there is no more information above a certain point, giving us highlights that are not as bright as they could be. To help us optimize our image, let's go back to the shaders list on ReShade and enable the very useful Insight shader. And we'll enable the Show Clipping option. This will allow us to see when we reach the maximum brightness by turning the pure white pixels to black. Let's head back to the ReGrade Plus UI and start lifting our exposure slider until we start to see clipping from the Insight shader. There, you can see that we see some clipping at the center of our image. This is our signal to back off the exposure slider until we have perfectly optimized for the dynamic range available to us. Let's now disable the Insight clipping feature, and we can adjust our saturation and vibrance on ReGrade Plus. If you've ever wondered what the difference is between the two controls, vibrance will increase the saturation of moderately saturated parts of the image while leaving the already strongly saturated parts as they were. Now, general saturation, on the other hand, will affect the entire image equally, which can cause color channel clipping if pushed too far, losing detail. These controls can and should be used complementarily with one another. You can increase vibrance while decreasing overall saturation, which will sort of flatten your colors out a bit. Or you can push the saturation very high and decrease vibrance. And this can get you an effect where the most saturated parts of the image remain saturated, while everything else moves toward gray. For this image, let's lift the vibrance just a bit, and also we'll lower the saturation a bit as well. There, that looks nice. Next, let's set our contrast manually using the curves control. We'll adjust the shadows first. As we adjust the curve, we'll be watching the dark parts of the image. Okay, let's create another point here to bring up our midtone detail. This looks good. Let's create another point to adjust our bright areas. For this image, pulling them down slightly looks nice. Additionally, we can add a black lift and further tweak the points on our curve until we are completely happy. Now that we've adjusted our curve, perhaps our bloom that we dialed in earlier is a bit much, so we can go back to the Solaris shader and pull back on that a bit. There. Let's head back to the ReGrade Plus UI to experiment with split toning. As we click on the shadow wheel, we can quickly get a feel for what that looks like by dragging our mouse around as we watch the image. Adjusting the shadows in this direction looks quite nice on the green areas of the image. Midtones can be adjusted in the same way. However, for this image, perhaps it isn't needed, so we can right-click to reset it back to neutral. Moving on to highlights, we can add in our own overall tint. With this effect, experimentation is key. If it looks good, it is good. The final section of ReGrade Plus is the Hue widget. Currently, it's set to the Hue versus Luma mode, which effectively means we can simultaneously control both the hue and the brightness of different colors in the image. If we click and drag this red node circularly around the widget, we can see on our image that the red areas will change color. If we instead drag the node inward, we can see that the red parts of our image will become darker, and by dragging outward, we can brighten the reds. Additionally, we can use modifier keys on the keyboard to make our changes more precise. While holding the Control key, we can limit the active node to hue movement only. If we instead hold the Shift key, we can limit movement to brightness or luma changes only. Let's adjust our reds now. We'll need to decide if we want to leave them alone, push them toward orange, or toward magenta. For this image, a slight push toward the left looks nice. Next, let's adjust the orange node. We can click and drag the node around to see how it affects the image. In the case of our image here, we'll just brighten the orange tones up a bit. Working our way down the color wheel, we come to the yellow node. An interesting thing about yellow is that it affects more than you might think. In fact, grass and trees have quite a bit of yellow in them, and we can see that here by how much the foliage is affected by our movements. Let's just brighten the yellow up a bit. For the green node, our image seems fine, and we can leave the green hues as they are. With anything, this is always a personal choice. You can choose to do a lot, or you can choose to do very little. Remember, if it looks good, it is good. Okay, now we've wrapped up our color grading in ReGrade Plus. Let's add some pop to the image by enabling the clarity shader. We can start by adjusting the texture control. This control affects the micro detail of surfaces in our image, while the local contrast control affects contrast in a much more broad way, looking almost flat when pushed in this direction and almost gloomy when pushed in this direction. For this image, since we have such a massive range of depth between our foreground and our background, enabling Clarity's depth separation feature gives us a lot of flexibility. If we click here, we can get a better idea of how the mask works. Anything we see that is black is our foreground, and anything white is our background. The grays in between will blend smoothly between our foreground and background setting. What's great about Clarity is that we can adjust exactly where we want our foreground and background to be in our depth mask. Let's adjust the balance control to be certain that our distant mountains are pure white, placing them completely in Clarity's background control. As we move the texture slider here for the foreground, we can see that the background is effectively ignored, which is great. Let's adjust the texture control until the stone surfaces in the foreground here gain a bit of grit. Now let's adjust the foreground local contrast. There, this value looks nice. Let's move to the background now, independently adjusting texture and local contrast. For this image, settings that soften the background seem to work really well. That looks awesome. Let's go with that. At this point, we can enable some anti-aliasing with Marty's Mod's custom SMAA shader. We don't really need to change any settings here. Just enabling the shader has cleaned up our jagged edges really nicely. For a final bit of polish, let's enable the LUT Manager shader here, and now go to the Add-ons tab in ReShade. Here we can find the LUT Manager add-on, where we have installed quite a few LUT packs. The LUT Manager shader and add-on allows us to browse and enable thousands of LUTs sourced from various places on the internet. Now, it should be stated that LUT Manager does not come with all of the LUTs that you see here. You will need to populate your LUT list according to your own taste. One nice way to browse the LUTs in our list is to hold the Shift key and then scroll the mouse wheel. As we scroll, the shader will apply the highlighted LUT to our image. As we find LUTs that we really like, we can right-click and add them to our favorites, where we can later compare to decide which ones we like the most. Moving back to the Shaders tab momentarily, the LUT Manager shader has a few handy features. First, there's an option that is generally safe to leave enabled all the time, giving us potentially smoother color transitions. There's also an option to show all of the LUTs in the current LUT pack on screen at once, and that can be enabled by clicking here. Perhaps more immediately useful, however, are the separated Luma and Chroma controls. The Chroma slider allows us to choose exactly how much of the LUT's color change we want to apply to our image. The Luma slider works the same way, however, it's not for the color, but rather for the brightness or contrast information from the LUT. This allows us to have more control over the exact changes that we want to apply. In the case of this image, since we did our own image balancing earlier in ReGrade Plus, let's disable the brightness changes from the LUT by turning the Luma slider all the way down. And then we can use only the color changes from the LUT by making sure our Chroma slider is maxed out. Once we're done selecting a few LUTs that we like on our image, and we've added them to our favorites, we can finally go back and check which ones are nice enough to save as a screenshot. And that's it. We've successfully edited an image in The Witcher 3 using only shaders. We really hope this has been helpful and enjoyable. Thanks for sticking around, and we wish you all the best on your own image editing adventures. This has been Trey with the Marty's Mods team. Have a great day.